Welcome to the class. We're going to talk today about capacity for care and length of stay. And the reason I call it the length of stay game is that I actually created this game, and the sort of history of how and why I created that game is I used to try to talk about capacity for care and length of stay. And whenever I did, what I found out was that it was a very hard concept for people to understand because somehow it kind of went against the way people had thought about things. So I kept trying to explain things, and I felt like people were getting frustrated. And then one day I came up with this idea to play this game. So instead of going through the whole game today, partly because we have this online audience with us as well as the audience for the class, what I'm going to do is we actually made a cartoon of the game, and I'm going to suggest that you guys go look and watch it sometime. And you can see it on aspcapro.org/stay. There's a whole web page about kind of length of stay issues. The fundamental idea with the game, and you'll get this from everything I'm going to talk about today, is that the longer animals on average stay in a shelter, so the longer the average length of stay is in a shelter, that can make a population grow and grow. The daily population. So the way that we think about that is if you have 5 animals come in every day and they each stay for 5 days, on average you're going to have about 25 animals in the shelter every day. The same 5 animals come in on average every day, but each one of those animals stays for 10 days. Now you're going to have twice as many animals in your shelter every day, right? You didn't help any more animals. You didn't serve any more animals. You didn't necessarily save any more lives. You might have actually saved fewer lives. So we're going to talk about that all today. But that's the fundamental concept. And then what I thought we could do is if you guys have, if there's further interest, then we could play the length of stay game during our discussion section coming up. So we can talk about that. The basic ideas that we're talking about here are the differences between capacity versus flow. So capacity is kind of how many animals can you care for at once. And flow is how many animals you can care for over time. And that's really important to think about because you can have a smaller population of animals, right? And still serve a huge number of animals if you think about, if you have a high flow. So if the animals are coming through very quickly. So we will come back to those concepts over and over the next hour. What we're really talking about, and it was Cindy Karsten, who was originally a UW vet student, who came up with this idea about this is really about your superpowers. This is really about your capacity. It's really about thinking about what are the limits of your superpowers. So your X-ray vision versus kryptonite, right? That like there are so many things that we can do for animals. There's so many ways that we can do rescue and save lives and rehabilitate and all of that, but that there are limits on that, and that capacity is our way really of thinking about where do your superpowers end? How far do your superpowers extend? And where do they end? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Why do we talk about average length of stay, and what does that mean really when we're talking about averaging it? It's important to think about when I'm talking about average length of stay of 4 days. I'm not saying that that's a time limit for all the animals in that shelter. I'm not saying that every animal should come in and leave within 4 days. What I'm saying is that we should never waste time for any individual animal. And each individual animal should get just the right amount of time, just the amount of time they need to get the best possible outcome for that animal. And when we think about averages, what that usually means is some animals are going to spend less time, while other animals are going to spend more time. So if we think about these pictures, if this little kitten spends a day or less in the animal shelter, which is probably all she might need to convince somebody to adopt her, and that was in fact the truth, because she went through foster care and got adopted from foster care, then we have more care day dollars to spend on these other animals, this injured kitty or that scared dog. And so when we use the average, what we're talking about is, that combination of all of that. But what we understand is that anytime we spend care days on one animal, anytime we save care days on one animal, we can theoretically spend those on another animal if we're doing a good job of budgeting our care days, and we'll talk about that. Sorry. So I'm going to talk about this really, really quickly, and the only reason I included this slide is everybody always says, well, why don't you use the median? I don't use the median because most people are used to the concept of averages a little better. It's important to realize that when you're talking about it, that if you have outliers when you're considering an average, so if you have some animals who stay a super long time, then your average will be different than the median, and the median might be a better representation of that kind of middle value. But for now, for today, and for most of what we do, the average works quite well. So let's think about this. I've given a bunch of hints to it already, but we've got shelter A and shelter B. Shelter A has an intake of 1,000 animals a year. Shelter B has an intake of 2,000 animals a year. Which one costs more to run each day? What do you think? Good, it depends, right? It depends on everything, right? So many things that are going on. This one has a capacity of 100 animals a day. The other has a capacity of 200 animals a day. Which one serves more animals each year? It depends again, right? And it's really, really key to remember that, because it wasn't very long ago that people thought, oh, we're having to euthanize in this shelter. We just need to build a bigger shelter and everything will be fine. And that was completely true, even here in Madison. When Dane County Humane Society had their old shelter, they thought, we're going to build this nice new shelter, and it's going to be bigger, and then everything will be fine. But it turned out that that new shelter filled up really, really fast. And it was just the same as it had been before, though actually now things have really improved so much in the whole community, and that's because of the entire picture, not just because of the size of the shelter. And in some cases, and this is what we're going to talk about a bunch today, the smaller shelter is the one that ends up being able to save more lives because they're efficient, they can control disease, they can move animals through, so their flow can get turned way up and they can do amazing things. And so that's why I just want to make sure you're thinking of things in that context. When we're talking about looking at capacity, we're talking about looking at what do you need and what do you have, and really finding that balance between your ability to provide care and the needs that are there. Because you really need, we want you to balance ability and the requirements for care. So this is something you can access this on the UC Davis website. I think this is a little spreadsheet again that Dr. Karsten and I made that just looks at the effect of changes in average length of stay. And so what you see here is we're saying this is a shelter, and it's just a sample shelter, but it's a sample shelter that has a live release rate of 50%. I'm just making that up because what I want you to see is that it doesn't have any effect on the outcome of the animals according to this model, though in fact this is usually a very life-saving thing to do. So let's say our length of stay to adoption is 25 days. Our length of stay to euthanasia is 10 days, and that's not going to change through this whole example. We start with a population of 350 animals in the shelter. And because the live release rate is 50%, we're saying the total intake per day is 20, and we're saying about 10 of those are going to go on a pathway towards euthanasia, and 10 are going towards adoption. And so our starting population is 350 animals. If we do something that reduces the average length of stay to adoption to 20 days from 25 days, you can see what happens, that the population is going to shrink down to 300 animals because the daily population contribution from the adoption pathway has shrunk by 50 animals. Is everybody following that? That as that length of stay shrinks, the population starts to shrink too. So now we're down to 300 animals. If we raise it, if we lower it down again to 15 days as the average length of stay, now we're down to 250 animals because the contribution to the daily population from that adoption pathway is now only 150 animals. Again, we're not adopting out fewer animals, they're just staying less time on their way to live release. So now we've reduced we've reduced the length of stay to live release, and that's had a decrease in population of 29%, which is pretty impressive. But we can do more if we get the adoption length of stay down to 10 days. Now our daily population is down to 200, and we've actually managed to change the population by 43%. So we've lowered the population by 43%. Think about what kind of impacts that has on health and welfare in the shelter, just even on your ability to provide care for each animal, for your ability to be able to give each animal some attention, to take animals for walks. Think about the impact that can have on housing, that each animal can have more space if there's only about half as many animals. And so this is like this really incredibly dramatic thing that can happen. And last week when I was talking to you about how sometimes we can see these really dramatic changes that happen either in one organization or in a community, this can sometimes be the kicker that can cause this really dramatic change. So I'm going to just go through a few examples of that and sort of talk about in more details how does that really work. So an animal care day, I've been saying that word, but what we really mean, that's kind of the basic unit of building block for capacity. And what we mean when we're talking about that is it's one animal's day, so their day in their life, plus 1 day's worth of care time, plus 1 day's of consumable supplies equals an animal care day. So it's not just a box to put an animal in for that day. It's everything involved in providing that care. And not all care days are created equal. We can see in this picture, you can guarantee that the experience that the animals are having in this cage, which is from a really long time ago in a shelter that we work with in Las Vegas, these animals are having a completely different experience than that little dog in the exact same shelter 1 year later after this shelter had made dramatic improvements to their population management. And so we know that that these experiences are different, and we can understand that, you know, the risks of infectious disease, of aggression, of everything else that are happening in this kennel are dramatically reduced in the kennel above. And so by having fewer animals in the shelter at any given time, in most cases we actually really increase the likelihood of life placement, which is that's what we're working for, right? So the cost for the shelter and the animal of a care day really depend on the housing that's provided. Some people could say, well, this is really cheap because we've just got this one housing unit and we're putting all these dogs together. But it's not necessarily, it may be cheap financially, but it's not cheap in terms of the success of the organization, in terms of the illness that gets created if you're going to respond to that illness. And everything about providing the care becomes very, very difficult. So the housing, the care provided, the consumable supplies, and then also the needs of the animal. It may be much less expensive to care for a healthy 1-year-old dog than it is to care for a senior dog or for a puppy. So we have to consider all of those things when we talk about it. When we talk about capacity of an organization, usually what we're talking about is the total care days at any one time equals that kind of physical capacity that they have. So all of those things, not as simple as just the housing unit. So how do we budget those care days? Really think about, well, how much do you have? Actual housing and care. And so we can look at this. We don't have time today to go into it, but we can, you can look and say, well, how many staff do you have to do intake at your shelter? How many animals come in? How many animals are going to come in every day? And you can compare those two. If your intake exam takes 15 minutes, you can't ask your staff to do that 6 times an hour and think that that's going to be successful, right? There's no possible way that they can accomplish that. So you have to look and say, well, okay, I have enough staff to do 4 intake exams every hour. What am I going to do to change to make sure that I meet that, I get into that balance that we talked about earlier? So it's important to think about what your actual capacity is. It's also really important to think about what your ideal capacity is. And here we say, don't be afraid to dream big, but also don't be afraid to dream small. There's one shelter I'm working with right now, and my recommendation to them is that they should actually have half as many cats in the shelter on every day compared to what they have now. And so they're going to work on how do they do that, because if they had half as many, I believe they'd be able to save a lot more lives, because they would bring their population within their capacity for care. How much do you need? You have to look at what you've agreed to do. So if you've agreed to have a county contract, or if you've agreed that you're going to bring in a certain number of animals, then you need to say, well, okay, I agreed I'm going to bring in 10 animals every day, and I'm going to hold them for at least 5 days. Then you better be sure you have the capacity to care for 50 animals at a time, because otherwise you're agreeing to something that you're not going to be able to do. And so that's something we want to be really sure that people are doing. What are your choices if your resources don't match your expenses? If we take this to an example of your credit card or your paycheck, we can say, if your resources don't match your expenses, you can keep spending more than you earn. You can pay an enormous amount of interest. You can take out loans and get less of what you need over time, and eventually you'll go bankrupt. But that's not what we want shelters to do. What's the other alternative? Well, you could buy crummier stuff. Nobody really wants to do that. You could buy less stuff. That might work pretty well. You could earn more money. You can get better bargains. And these last three in particular, I think the best analogy that we can use when we're talking about length of stay and capacity, because that's what we're saying, is be more efficient, be smart with your resources, think about the way animals are moving through, and you will, in fact, get better bargains and quit wasting money. And doing those things is investing wisely, and that's what we think really brings about increases in life saving. And so that's why it's so important to us. When we think about length of stay, we think about it as sort of being part of a pathway. So we can break it down into all these different sort of factors. So there's this part that we think of as shelter intake, holding, rehabilitation or treatment. They're moving towards an outcome, and then they're having this outcome. What we want is we want this to be a straight shot. For some animals, obviously, it's not a totally straight shot, because they need some sort of rehabilitation or they need some sort of treatment. Again, we want this to be done efficiently so that they're getting what they need in the amount of time they need, but not with any huge detours. But here's what can happen, is we can wedge these detours into this straight shot pathway, and when we do this, we create risks for those animals. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an example about that. So what do we mean when we're talking about defining a pathway? We're talking about they're going from intake to outcome. So one example of that might be an animal comes in stray, has to go from stray holding to adoption to their outcome. Maybe it's an owner surrender that comes in and moves to adoption. In most cases, they should actually be able to do that with no holding at all, but that requires efficiency on the part of the shelter to get that animal moved through to outcome. What about a trap, neuter, return program? Is that something we can do where the animal doesn't have to spend time in the shelter at all? Or maybe they have to just come in for one day. Maybe that's something we can offer. So if someone calls about a feral cat, we can say, you know what, we don't take feral cats, but we do offer this alternate service for them. So these are all different pathways that can happen. Behavior rehabilitation before adoption. Again, we're not saying animals don't get the care they need. It's just that they get the care they need in the most efficient way possible. Medical rehabilitation before adoption. This is also a really important pathway that some animals have a limited expectation for positive outcome, and that's something we want to try to identify early to see if we can change it. And if we can't change it because that animal is suffering and it's not an animal that we can save, then again, we want this pathway also to be efficient, because we don't want animals languishing and suffering when we know there isn't a positive outcome for them on the other end. So as you think about capacity, you really want to think for each pathway, evaluate each part of that sort of what we're hoping will be that straight shot, to see how straight you can make it. What we need to put into that pathway to make sure things flow smoothly, and often what we'll call those are kind of the critical flow-through points in the pathway. So here's an example of a kitten named Ichi and his sister, the beauty queen. So they show up to a shelter, they're underage, they have a high susceptibility to disease, so they're at risk. They need socialization, but they also have, if you look at them, a pretty high potential for adoption. We can take these kittens and do their stray holding in foster care. We can give them supportive care while they're in foster. We can return them to the shelter for a neuter, microchip, and exam, and then they could be adopted from foster. And if we did that, look at that beautiful straight shot. And that is, in fact, what those guys experienced, and it was fantastic. So these guys spent probably a couple of hours in an animal shelter, and the rest of the time in foster care. The alternate long and winding pathway that does exist for many kittens that we try to avoid is they come in stray, they sit in shelter housing. After 7 to 10 days, they develop URI. We'll talk about why that is a little bit later. Waiting for a foster home. Now they're trying to get to a foster home, but now they have to find a foster home that's willing to take sick kittens, not a foster home that's willing to take healthy kittens. So it's harder to do. So again, another wedge in our straight shot of the pathway. They finally find foster placement for treatment, but now they need treatment, not just socialization. So it may take longer for them to get in and out of their foster care. Then they come back. They get returned for their neuter, their microchip, and exam, but they have to wait for surgery because even though they came back, whatever day they came back, their surgery wasn't scheduled, so now they need more days to wait in the shelter. Finally, they get their neuter. Now they're waiting for adoption, and maybe because they went in and went into the shelter for adoption, and in the end, what we hope is that they still would have the same outcome. But in many shelters, this many detours could end up meaning that they wouldn't still be saved because the amount of resources that are involved in getting these animals through this bumpy pathway are much greater than getting those same kittens through a sure, a really nice, straight, smooth pathway. So that's just one example. I want to talk now about let's break down our straight shot, and let's start out by looking just at the intake piece of it. And this is something we like to talk about a lot, and we call it managed intake. So instead of saying, you know what, everything that comes to us, we're just going to take it. It's just coming, and then we're going to deal with it. Now we're going to start doing some planning. We're going to start thinking about the way the intake comes to us, and we're going to manage that. The first question to ask is, should they stay where they are? Is it really the best thing? And this goes back again to really thinking about your superpowers. Is it really the best thing for that animal to come into your shelter at all? And that's a question I think should be asked every single time an animal comes to a shelter. Is this the best thing for this animal? Just talked to a shelter yesterday, and one of the questions was, what do we do with all these neonatal kittens, these very, very young kittens that people are picking up and bringing in? One of our responses was, why don't you leave them where they are? I'm sure their mother isn't there. And that's something that we talk about all the time, right, with wildlife. We have all sorts of campaigns about, the baby bunnies are just there, the mom's coming right back. But we don't talk about it as much for cats, and it's time for us to start really thinking about that, because scooping those kittens up and bringing them in may not necessarily be the best thing for them. It's probably a lot better for them to stay with their mom. So at least to start investigating and making sure that the mom isn't around and just scared off because you showed up before you take them, and to start really thinking about what are the signs in the kittens that you found that their mom either is around or is not around, and what would make you want to bring the kittens in versus not. The other really great example that we use for this is a program called Feral Freedom. That has started all over the place, but there's a great example of it in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it. The primary sort of foundation of it is that when cats come in that are community cats, instead of coming into the shelter, those animals are spayed and neutered and vaccinated and put back where they were. There's, even for lost cats, there's research out of Ohio that shows us that those cats are 18% more likely to get back home if you leave them where they are compared to bringing them into an animal shelter. So for a lot of people, this is like a huge shift in thinking, because we all thought that bringing animals to the shelter was the right thing to do. But we always really have to balance this question of, is it really the best thing for the animal? So in this case, this is a graph from Jacksonville, Florida, where we see their before live release and then their after live release. And you can see they went from about a 4% live release up to over a 70% live release. And here's the difference in the number of cats who were euthanized for URI during this time period. Just phenomenal. And so we have to really think carefully about this pre-intake and intake period. Another way of sort of managing intake is to allow some of that intake length of stay, or some of that length of stay, to happen outside the shelter. So you can schedule intake so that and during that scheduled time, you can get animals ready to go. You can have animals go out to foster and then have the return scheduled. And there's programs called Ready, Set, Go that I'm going to talk about that get an animal all ready for adoption if someone's planning to surrender that animal. And we used to really think, oh my gosh, if we do that, the worst possible thing will happen to that animal. But I'm going to come back and sort of show you some research surrounding that. This is another example of this little puppy. If this little puppy has to grow up in an animal shelter, that's not going to be the best thing for that puppy, and it's not going to be the best thing for the shelter. So anything we can do to remove length of stay, days, for any individual animal is usually better for that individual animal, and also better for all the other animals in the entire population of the shelter. This is a slide that Kate Hurley put together, and I love it. It's from California, and apparently you can make a choice when you're going to the DMV. You can either make an appointment, and when you show up, you may have to wait a little while to get your appointment, but usually not too long, or you can just go sit and wait if you show up and you don't make the appointment. So which would you choose? And I think a lot of shelters have been really hesitant to do this because they felt like, oh, well, people wouldn't want to wait, but it turns out when you start asking people, most people are just fine with making an appointment. They recognize that they have to make appointments for all sorts of things. And having that appointment schedule lets shelters build capacity at the times where the animals are going to be coming in, and so they can do a better job of doing it. So this is from the Animal Humane Society up in Minneapolis, and they wanted to implement managed intake, and so they started doing it. In the first 6 months, they tried to get owners to make appointments, but also allow drop-off if the people didn't want to do it. And then after that, they decided that they wouldn't accommodate people just dropping off unless there was kind of some urgent need. What their experience was that their intake went down by about 25%. Their placement rate went up by 20%. Now their placement rate is up to 81%, which is fantastic. Their euthanasia rate went down 39% and is now only 20%. Their length of stay for cats was well over a month, and now it's down to 10.5 days. For dogs, it's down to 12 days. And they had a call center that was calling people back about these appointments, and what they found is that of those who didn't make an appointment, 40% had either rehomed on their own or used some other resource that had been provided and decided to keep the animal. There was a very slight increase in feline impounds for local animal control, but now, because everything is flowing so much more smoothly through their shelter, they're actually able to transfer cats from animal control on a weekly basis. They had very small stainless steel cat cages that was just one box per cat, and they were able to actually connect 3 of them. So now each cat gets 3 cages to themselves, and that's because of these reductions in length of stay. This is another slide Dr. Hurley made from a shelter that we work with in Erie County, New York. And what's really interesting here is this pie chart sort of represents the feline outcomes in California. You can see this big red, 71% of those animals were euthanized. And so when we think about, well, how bad could it be turning animals away, Erie County found this is, and you can see how similar this shape is. There's only a very, very small number of those animals who were turned away that ended up with a bad outcome, but almost the same number ended up with really a great outcome. Either they were rehomed, they found an owner, or the animal was taken to rescue. Does this make sense? So actually managing their intake didn't lead to more negative outcomes. It led to enormously more positive outcomes. And the fear had been, well, we're the only game in town. If we don't take these animals, something terrible will happen to them. And it turns out, no, that's actually really not true. So Ready, Set, Go is a program that we love, that we try to get shelters to do. It's just one way of sort of managing length of stay before the animal comes to the shelter, so you can get the animal vaccinated, spayed and neutered, examined. You can even do a behavioral evaluation, so you know when that animal comes that it can go straight up for adoption, and you've got all the information that you need about that animal before it comes. This is coming from another shelter that went forward to ask about managed intake. We've managed to find homes for about 500 more animals a year by doing this. I think that in general the success has come down to the power of asking. We never asked anyone before. When we started, overwhelmingly people said yes, especially for cats and kittens that would have otherwise been an automatic euthanasia due to the fact that they were already ill and our foster program was already full and the shelter had no additional space. Of course, we still get people who say no, but even the fact that we're sharing accountability with the general public has raised staff morale in addition to saving more lives. So this idea of planning, it seems so obvious, I think, when you really sit down and think about it, but for some reason it's not the way most shelters were functioning, and it's still not the way many shelters are functioning, where they have the ability to plan and control what's happening. So when we think about this next area, this after intake, this pre-adoption length of stay, what can we do to make that shorter? Again, I talked about animals going to foster very quickly. This is a really key feature, is this idea of being very proactive about recruiting foster homes who are there and they're on deck and they're ready, because you know kittens are coming in, you know puppies are coming in, and so they're there and they're going to take those animals right away. Rather than the alternative, which is a very reactive model, oh my gosh, it's July and a litter of kittens came in, I better try to find a foster home. And when you use that more reactive method, the kittens can sit and wait sometimes for a week or 2 weeks. There was one shelter that we worked with that had an entire ward that was just dedicated to kittens waiting to go to foster care. And so if you kind of remove that middle and you just say the kitten shows up, it goes to foster, you can, again, reduce length of stay really, really dramatically. It's important to evaluate stray hold in this period too, and it's just so crucial, because we see that there are usually legal obligations, but we have to think about when those legal obligations are being set, it's very important to think about what's best for the animals. And there is often this push to say, oh, well, the longer the stray hold is, the more likely the animal would get back to its home. But we find that that's not actually true, and when we look at average length of stay to reclaim by owner, it's usually quite a short period of time. So in Dane County, for example, the return to owner rate for strays is over 60%. That's huge. It's something that is very, very nice in this community. When does that happen? 10 days after the dog comes in? No, usually it's the same day. Sometimes it's the next day, but it's not a week later. So having a 7-day stray holding period in the state of Wisconsin puts an enormous burden on the shelters and also on those animals who can't move on to another live release outcome when no one is coming for them. The live release for cats is usually significantly lower. In Dane County, it's over 10%, which is great. We rarely see it over 10%. But even so, it's very, very low. And so the likelihood of a cat coming in straight to a shelter and getting back home is not increased by a dramatically increased stray holding period. In fact, the likelihood of the animals becoming ill in the shelter's care is dramatically increased. So some cities have gone to a whole different way of thinking about it, where they say for live release, the stray hold is very short, but for euthanasia, the stray hold would be a bit longer. If the animal has no evidence of ownership or no identification on it, then the stray hold is very short. If it has identification, then we make the stray hold a little bit longer. And this way of evaluating these kinds of things can make for healthier shelters and for healthier animals and increase live release dramatically. Sorry. Usually we try to convince shelters to minimize optional intake quarantines. So the only time that we might encourage a shelter to do an intake quarantine is if they're taking animals from another shelter that they know has a history of infectious disease. And even then, we'd rather put a protocol in place to help them identify which animals are at risk and which animals aren't at risk. Because again, we can't take this idea of just adding a huge hunk of length of stay onto an animal's stay lightly. We can't think that by doing that we're not increasing risk. And so we're constantly trying to sort of move animals through unless we have some very, very good reason to hold that animal back. Does everybody know what I mean by an intake quarantine? Open selection is another program that we use, and this is a program that we're modeling here in Dane County as well, where when an animal comes in during its stray holding period, again in Wisconsin we have this very, very long stray holding period of 7 days, rather than have the animals not utilize their 7 days to try to find a home, we let the cats go up for adoption selection during their 7 days, and then on the 8th day they can actually go home with their new owner. This has been incredibly dramatic at Dane County Humane Society, where this has cut the length of stay to about 1/3 of what it used to be for cats. And so what happens here is they the animal comes in, they identify this as a great candidate for adoption. We're going to put it up. We put a sign on it that says owner selection. This one actually already has an owner selection adoption hold. That means somebody came in and they saw this cat or kitten while it was in its stray holding period, and they said, if the owner doesn't come, then I want to adopt this cat. And they're told what day they can come pick the cat up, and then they show up. If for some reason the owner shows up first, they haven't had a single person who wasn't really happy for that animal that its owner came and found them, and the person just picks another cat. Again, only very small number of cats are returned to their owner, so that happens infrequently. Most of the cats who are returned to their owners come into the shelter with a tag. And so animals who come in with tags wouldn't be put up for open selection. Yeah?
By tag, do you mean like a physical collar, or do you mean microchips?
I mean a physical collar and a tag, and that's the question was, do I mean a physical tag or a microchip? And one of the things that we've been seeing, and it's really disheartening, but it seems to be true, is that often when microchips are identified in animal shelters, the microchip leads to a dead end rather than leading back to the owner. And so more and more we're finding that we really, really want to encourage people to put collars and tags on their animals. Because what ends up happening is the animal comes in with a microchip that doesn't lead anywhere, but because of the microchip, the shelter is required to hold the animal for a long period of time. So it's almost becoming like this unlucky thing that can happen to you as a cat in a shelter. Yes?
What might the reasons be for that dead end of the chipping?
So what might the reasons be for the dead end on the chipping? Does anybody know? Yeah. So somebody doesn't register the chip in the first place, so the chip can go in, but it can be blank. Sometimes it's a chip, but the person moved, and then they gave the cat to somebody else, and the phone number doesn't go anywhere anymore. They didn't update that registration. All sorts of reasons like that. So we really like to push collar and tag, because it's really easy to find. The other thing is if there's a collar and a tag and somebody finds the animal in your neighborhood and they don't happen to have a microchip scanner in their back pocket, but it does say that the dog lives half a block over there, hopefully they'll just bring the dog back to you, and then the dog can skip the shelter completely. And we even there are some animal control departments that are even doing that, and they call it return in the field. So if they find a dog that got lost, they'll just take it home instead of taking it to the shelter if it has a tag. The most famous of those programs is from Calgary, Canada, and they call it your license is your ticket home. So if you have your dog licensed and the dog is lost and picked up, they'll try to bring it home to you first. Fast track is another kind of way of thinking about this, and it goes back to when I was talking about averages, that the idea with fast tracking animals is to say, well, let's think about this as two separate pathways, that we have one pathway that kind of moves slowly, and then we have this other pathway that moves kind of quickly, sometimes really, really quickly. And so what we can do is we can say, well, you know what? Those animals who move quickly don't need very much length of stay, so let's just make sure that we're always putting them up for adoption very, very quickly, because they go up and they leave. And they go up and they leave, and they go up and they leave. If we don't prioritize them, you can end up with a lot of slow track animals up for adoption and all these fast trackers waiting to go. And while they're waiting, they lose their fast track ability, right? They get sick, they get frustrated, they develop poor behavior, all those kinds of things. And so what we found is by kind of splitting that with fast track, slow track, that we can really maximize our life-saving potential by letting those animals go through. And sometimes what they end up is needing just a very small, the way I think of it is like lanes on the highway. And the fast trackers, a lot of the time, all they need is one lane because they're going so fast that you can just keep putting them through, and then they don't end up getting stuck. And what we find is that the slow track animals still go at the same rate as long as we're smart about the way we prioritize. So this is from an example from the Animal Rescue League of Boston, and I worked with them on this fast track program. And this is from their veterinarian. We used to pick pretty much by date of intake who would go up for adoption, but now any fast track cat gets priority in their exams. We designate whether a cat is fast or slow on the move up board, and any fast track cat should always be moved up prior to slow track cats. Slow track cats aren't actually waiting any longer than they were before for their exams, as the whole process of prioritizing fast track cats expedites things. This is a graph that shows how their length of stay has changed. And so if we look up here, these are all the cats, and the blue line is the 2010, green is 2008, and red is 2009. And so even for the adult cats, the length of stay was dramatically dropped, and for kittens, it was dropped almost in half, the length of stay, the average length of stay for all animals, just by letting the fast track go through quickly. One thing that's really impressive when we think about care days for this particular shelter, that their care day total in 2009 was 43,000, and their care day total in 2010 was about 32,000, and they were able to admit almost 200 cats more and adopted out about 200 cats more with fewer length of stay. And so if you start to think about resource investment and how much it costs to keep an animal for a day, think about how much money is saved by saving 10,000 care days a year. It's enormous. And so this shelter was actually able to cut holes in their cages as well. Adoption readiness is another whole thing to think about in this category of, moving towards adoption, to be sure that things are getting scheduled, that you know what the next move is for that animal. So there should never be an animal in the shelter that's just kind of sitting there waiting, and nobody's really sure what they're waiting for. So the way I think about this, my analogy is they should always be on a train to somewhere, and they should know what the next stop is. So do they need surgery? Is it scheduled? Do they need an exam? Is it scheduled? Do they need a housing unit? Is that planned? What's going on? Turning up the flow is incredibly important, and that's something I want to spend, just a little bit of time talking about. That people often say, well, okay, but if we were going to save more lives, we would need more adoptions. And we say, well, sure, you do. And so the important thing for that is to really think about that. A huge part of that is marketing. And a huge part of it is also removing the barriers that get put in place. That we find that oftentimes there are restrictive adoption policies or limited hours, poor customer service or high fees. All of these things can really get in the way of kind of opening the tap to let that flow run through. An incredibly amazing example of this is a shelter that we're working with in Las Vegas, where we challenged them to just do a free cat adoption event. They had never done one before. They felt like it was really important for them to be charging for their adoptions, but they always were very crowded and weren't able to save as many cats as they wanted to. And they did an unbelievable promotion. They called it the Free for All, and they cleared the shelter of all the cats. First, it was the original promotion was just for kittens because they had so many kittens in the shelter at the time. So they put out the promotion for kittens and they adopted out all the kittens, and then people were asking if they could have free cats too. And so then they made the cat adoptions free as well, and all of the cats left the shelter, which was really incredible thing to see. They had to trust their adoption policy, so they weren't just giving away cats to whoever. They still required identification, and they talk to people and make the matches with those people. But it was a dramatic increase in their ability to adopt animals out by removing barriers to adoption. Dr. Karsten, who's coming in a couple of weeks, is going to talk about those barriers as well when she talks about sort of removing or looking at the myths surrounding sheltering. And there's lots of those kinds of myths about adopting animals out. So it'd be exciting to hear what she talks about with that. So when we talk about length of stay, I've been sort of intimating this, but length of stay is also really intricately tangled up with the number of animals that you have available for adoption. And so we often call that adoption capacity. And what we've found is that more is not always better. And in fact, more is often not better, but not always. Sometimes you actually need more animals up for adoption. But this is just a little bit of a research study, that looked at, just is more better. And so what we found is that like this whole idea of choice, this is the basis in some ways of like why Costco is successful, is rather than give you lots of different choices, they give you one choice that they really think is going to be the choice that you want. Many people are overwhelmed by making lots of choices, and so sometimes having fewer animals is less overwhelming to people, fewer animals at any given time. So that's one reason to have fewer. The other is this whole idea that we call adoption-driven capacity. And what we're saying basically is that you want to have a good match between the number of adoptions you're likely to do and the number of animals you have up for adoption. So the way that I think about this, there's all kinds of math that we do surrounding this, and I'm not going to go into that in too much detail today because we just don't have time in a 1-hour lecture about it. But the idea is, say you have 30 animals up for adoption in your shelter, and you're likely to do 30 adoptions that month. How do we know you're likely to do that? We can look at your historical data and say you've done 30 adoptions every month for the last 5 years. If you put 30 animals up for adoption, what's going to be the average length of stay? It's about a month, right? Because on average, one is going to get adopted every day. So the average would be that everybody will stay about a month. And so if we shrink that number, we say, well, now we're going to have 15 up for adoption at any given time, but we're still going to do 30 adoptions per month. Now the length of stay for everybody shrinks too, down to about 15 days. And so what we're not saying is that we're adopting fewer animals, but we're changing the flow. And by changing the flow, we change the length of stay, we keep animals healthier, we spend fewer resources, and that sort of cycle creates this really cool positive cycle that ends up maximizing the life-saving potential of the organization. In the discussion section, we can go through some of the math about that. But it's really important. This is like one of those fundamental things, and it's the reason that I cover this every single year in the course, because so many of the things that you're going to hear that come after this depend on you believing that that's true. That the longer animals stay in a shelter, if it's unnecessary time, the more risks there are to that individual animal and the more risks there are to the population as a whole. It's Easier said than done. This is from an organization we've heard repeatedly about the difference it can make, but it's initially hard to decrease your overall intake in numbers housed in adoptions. We have kitty condos and are starting to move toward having them in a duplex instead of a single, but we've been afraid to completely make the change. This is something that a lot of shelters get nervous about, and so what we often do is have them start with one population, or we have them start fast tracking, and they start to see this happen, and that's where it gets really exciting, because once it starts happening, it really does create this positive cycle that kind of pulls things along with it. This is research results from the ASPCA. They actually did a little study at Less is More on the adoption floor, and what they did is they looked at what they call the turnover rate. So this had to do with that sort of science of choice. If you give too many options, is it too overwhelming? And what they found in this case was that when they cut the number of animals that were up on the adoption floor, that although fewer people came into the shelter, it was traditionally a slower month anyway, total cat adoptions increased. And so the turnover rate went up. What they never wanted to see was somebody coming in, feeling overwhelmed and leaving. And so they weren't seeing that as much. And they did that. And this is just from a shelter that actually, this is Jacksonville Humane, that made a change, and they gave cats a double-sided housing unit instead of a single housing unit, so they effectively cut their adoption population in half. The most exciting thing for me is our change in the cat adoption area. We have kitty condos that you can open up, and now we give all adult cats up and down duplex. The cats can all be at eye level now and have a nice separation from their food, water, and litter, and have more room. We have a volunteer make a bunch of cage covers, like the quiet time covers that we place on the bottom of the cage. With the duplexes, the kennel staff can freshen one half and then the other with minimal stress to the cat. So that's incredible. Now we can even change our whole process of care, right? Now we can do spot cleaning in a way that doesn't stress the cats and also can really minimize the amount of infectious disease that's happening. All of the changes in the cat adoption area have led to an increase in our adult cat adoption, decrease in the incidence of cat scratches and bites, and that's also huge, and a significant reduction in our URI rate. For the first time since I have been here, and the first time anyone can remember, we had no cats in our cat isolation, and this lasted for a few weeks. Since kitten season started, we've gotten a slight increase in URI, but cat isolation is staying less than half full, which is drastically different than last year. I just thought you might appreciate a positive update now and then, and in fact, we do. So this is also available. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but basically what we can do is we can use a little spreadsheet. You can use math to kind of calculate what is the practical number, the most productive number of animals for an organization to make available for adoption based on a target length of stay and the number of animals that they're likely to adopt. Sometimes we want to include an increase factor. Sometimes the shelter is going to say, well, we think if we do this, we'll be able to increase our adoptions by a third. And we hope that's true, and so we can try to figure that in. How do you get started with this? What if you have 350 cats? How do you get down to 200? We don't ever want to suggest that a shelter does that by euthanizing animals. If anybody ever thinks that's what I'm saying, please stop. This is a way of maximizing life-saving potential. And so usually what we try to do is we do it by having a huge adoption special where they can pull the animals through. How much does it cost? This is Jacksonville. It usually saves money. And so that's something, that's just very important to realize, that when we're talking about all of this, what we're talking about is saving money. This isn't all just true for cats, it's true for dogs too. This is from Wisconsin Humane in Milwaukee. What you see over here is a graph of kind of how their population for dogs was going through these couple of years from 2006 to 2010. You can see how much disease they had in the shelter at that time. It was going up and up. They needed an intervention, and the intervention was, what they had been doing was they had been using their double-sided kennels with the guillotine door down, so they had one dog on each side of the kennel, and they thought that was a better way of approaching it because they could get more dogs in. So they thought that would mean they could adopt more dogs. They made an intervention and they decided what they wanted to do was not do that anymore and dramatically reduced the in-shelter population of dogs. And you can see how dramatically their length of stay for dogs came down by giving each dog the double-sided run. So again, they could shift the dogs from side to clean, which made things easier for the staff and also exposed the dogs to less disease. Hopefully you can see this. At one point they had dogs in the double-sided kennels, but also in crates. Then first they removed all the crates, and then they only used double-sided runs. And so you can see that their population went down to an average dog count of about 180 dogs, down to about 70 dogs. And they had incredibly much less URI transmission in their dogs, and their adoptions stayed the same and have even increased. So it's true for cats, it's true for dogs. Doing population rounds helps to support all of this. So in my fantasy world, there is someone in every shelter chasing everyone around, having them appreciate the value of a length of one day in the life of that animal in that shelter. So the value of that single care day is incredibly important. And if we do population rounds, we can be always checking to make sure that that animal is on the train it's supposed to be on, and that the stops at all the stations are scheduled, and that nobody's fallen off the radar, and that we're always making another choice, the next choice for that animal. When we think about population rounds, really what we're talking about everything on this list, so really consider the medical and behavioral health, the stage of movement towards the outcome, what pathway is the animal on, is everything that we need on the paperwork as it should be, are the dates correct, is there anything else that we need to take extra steps about? And one of my favorite things that I've ever heard from when Rich Avanzino from Maddie's Fund used to be the director at the San Francisco SPCA is that when an animal had been in the shelter for 2 weeks, he would call a staff emergency and say, what do we need to do to get this animal out of the shelter? And I love that. What I really think is it should happen even before 2 weeks. I think it should happen when the animal comes to you. And we've evolved so much from that time that I think we should be saying, is this animal going to need something special from us to get it out? And just get on it as soon as you possibly can. But again, every day should be sort of asking that animal, what do you need from me today? What can I do? Putting it all together. So what are we saying when we're talking about? We're talking about length of stay and capacity and this positive cycle that we want to get into and this vicious cycle that we want to really be careful to stay out of, that we want shelters to set the bar high for the quality of care, determine what a target length of stay should be, and in most cases it's not going to be longer than 10 to 14 days as an ideal amount of time for animals to be in a shelter. Sometimes it's going to be even shorter than that. Use multiple strategies to decrease length of stay, not just one, but you should always be thinking, what can we do to decrease length of stay? One of the things that I love, but it also cracks me up whenever I talk to Matt Whitty from Wisconsin Humane. He can walk into the back of a conference room where I'm giving a presentation and I can say, Matt, what's your average length of stay right now? And he knows because he's constantly watching it because they see rising length of stay as a risk factor. Monitor and celebrate your success. Create that positive cycle because that positive cycle will create more positive outcomes and more community programs that can help reduce intake. And that all goes back into our positive cycle until we all go retire and play with puppies. We hope that shelters win all the time. So the reason this slide set is on my ASPCA template is because this slide set comes from a set of about 4 or 5 presentations that I did for the ASPCA. So if you're interested in this information, go to ASPCA Pro and look because we've got about 4 or 5 presentations there that go into all the details of how to calculate capacity and how to reduce length of stay.
Sandra?
Yes.
There's a question online.
Yeah.
Where can I find more info on population wellness rounds?
On the UC Davis website, we have a information sheet on population wellness rounds, and we also have done webinars about it for ASPCA Pro, so I would look for the webinars on ASPCA Pro as well. If you have other questions, you can also email me directly.